now call Deputy Lucinda Creighton.
Garmagat, Las Ciancorla. I think it's worth recalling as we go through this debate on this legislation, the amount of money that has already been spent on Irish Water. So far, and it's all obviously taxpayers' money, the bill looks like the following. It borrowed €250 million from the National Pension Reserve Fund in 2013. It collected a further €240 million from the proceeds of property tax, which of course was never intended to go to Irish Water originally, in 2014. It gained €490 million from the local government fund in 2014. It will take €190 million from businesses large and small every year, and it will continue to collect substantially less than the €500 million a year which was originally intended, but nonetheless a substantial amount of money from householders every year, at least up until the end of 2018, at which point we don't know how much that bill will spiral. So over €1 billion has already been raised for Irish Water, and there's a lot more to come, as we know. The lack of transparency in all of this is quite extraordinary. We still don't have any transparency as to how much money the state has paid to SiteServe, which was sold to Millington for approximately €45.42 million in cash from the state owned by IBRC. A subsidiary of the company of SiteServe, Sierra, was awarded a multi-million euro contract for the installation of water meters, yet the taxpayer who is footing the bill for all of this has never been told how much they're paying to this company. I find that quite extraordinary, particularly given that we have a government that came in heralding a new era of new politics, democratic revolution and so on. The secrecy that has surrounded all of this is quite amazing. Of course, we know that this government essentially lost all moral authority when it comes to Irish Water on the 18th of December 2013, when it rammed through all stages of the legislation that was flagged since the first day the government met. Rammed it through in a few hours, all stages. We all recall deputies walked out, some stayed, tried to raise issues. My colleagues Deputy Timmins and Deputy Naughton tried to raise the issue of poor drinking water and various issues about cost and scale and so on, none of which was heeded. It was all rammed through the government before Christmas. To me, the Irish Water fiasco just epitomises all that has gone wrong with this government, frankly, and it's really disappointing. I could start on the issue of cronyism, the fact that unsuccessful candidates for the local elections were appointed to the board of Irish Water. Some also held positions as drivers for ministers directly linked to Irish Water, and so on and so forth. The guillotine debate, I think, really just shows the arrogant attitude of this government, which is that we know best. We don't really have any regard for the democratic institutions of the state. We don't have any regard, clearly, for the opposition. We know that. We've no regard for the Parliament, which is the forum where members of the public express their democratic intentions. And I think that's really regrettable. All of the problems with Irish Water could have been predicted. Many of them were predicted. They were predicted in the Shannon debate. It's worth reading the transcript. It's also very interesting to read what then Minister of State Deputy O'Dowd said in the Shannon, where actually his concerns about Irish Water were fairly apparent if you read between the lines. But nonetheless, the government just refused to engage, rammed through the legislation, and we are as where we are, as that dreadful saying goes. This debate is no different, and Deputy O'Snoddig just referred to the fact that there are no government deputies in the House. I'm not aware of any government deputy speaking at all today, just one opposition member after another. It's a slightly longer version of what happened in December of last year. And it once again shows the flagrant disregard that this government has for this House and the total contempt it has ultimately for the electorate. And I don't blame Minister O'Riordan. You're not responsible for this legislation. I don't know why the ministers who aren't here, but it is really regrettable. The fact there are no government backbenchers here, I suppose they're probably out knocking on doors preparing for a general election. No other ministers here. Cabinet collective responsibility seems to be a thing of the past. And this legislation will be rammed through as well. I think it's worth remembering what Irish Water was supposed to do, and probably the most instructive thing to do is to just quote directly from the Fine Gael manifesto of 2011 and the New Era document of 2009, because that's where this concept came from. And it was a good concept. That's the really sad thing. New Era was supposed to, and I quote, deliver real economies of scale by bringing all of Ireland's water assets under the ownership of one state company, Irish Water. Economies of scale. It was supposed to be about efficiency. It was supposed to be about an efficient utility delivering high-quality water for our citizens. That hasn't happened. It went on to say the fragmented nature of the water industry, in which 34 local authorities are responsible for investment and maintenance, also means that there are currently no real economies of scale. The Fine Gael manifesto in 2011 clearly stated Fine Gael will introduce a fair funding model, that's certainly beyond debate now, to deliver, and I quote, clean and reliable water. We will not ask homeowners to pay for a broken and unreliable system. And that is why Fine Gael will only introduce water charging after the establishment of a new state-owned water utility company to take over responsibility from the separate local authorities for Ireland's water infrastructure and to drive new investment. That was the New Era document in 2009. None of that has happened. None of it. In fact, these are just more of the broken promises that have become so inextricably linked in the minds of the public with this government. And it's really unfortunate because this was a great opportunity. The whole concept of conservation, which was clearly integral to the New Era document and indeed to the manifesto and indeed to the programme of government, has been completely dropped, and that's what this bill is about. It's about pandering to populism rather than actually trying to implement a new way of doing business by this government. The idea of clean and reliable water being in place before anybody would be charged, that's explicitly what it said in the Fine Gael manifesto in 2011. The commitment to deliver clean and reliable water before charges be implemented, that has been clearly thrown out the window. We know that there are still boil water notices in Roscommon, also in Wicklow and in other parts of the country. And I think the biggest joke of all, frankly, is the idea of efficiency and economies of scale, because they're entirely absent from this legislation, and they are entirely absent from the whole premise of this Irish water entity that has been established by the government. And the reason for that is a thing called the Irish Water Consultative Group, which is a secretive, behind closed door group that was established in 2012 and met throughout the earlier months of 2013 and reported, I think, around July 2013. And it was made up of officials from SIP2, Impact, the TEEU, ICTU, WSTO, Department of Environment and Local Government. It was conducted behind closed doors. Minutes were never published. I've put down several parliamentary questions. I've been promised that the minutes will be forwarded to me. I certainly haven't received them yet. Perhaps they'll come. But this was essentially, I think the line was that this was to lead to the development of a so-called overarching framework to facilitate collaboration between Irish Water and local authorities. In fact, it was just a stitch-up. It was a stitch-up with the unions to ensure that Irish Water would become the second HSE. So all of the opportunity to reform and to achieve those economies of scale and to achieve those savings that were supposed to be introduced by merging the water service from the 34 local authorities into one utility to ensure that that essentially didn't happen and its objectives would fail. That's really what it was all about, and it's a dreadful shame. If we talk about what's actually in this bill, flat charges of €160 or 260 until 2018, that again proves that there will be no conservation. I think the rollout of meters will continue, but the meters are redundant, and I think it's apparent that, and we said this last year when the legislation was being introduced, that charges just simply shouldn't have been introduced until the meters had been rolled out. The government insisted on proceeding, and well, that has led us to the mess that we've seen over the last few months. A so-called water conservation grant is lauded in this legislation of €100. What an insult. I mean, the idea that a €100 grant with, as far as I can see, no terms and conditions, no criteria, no requirements that have yet, perhaps they will be enunciated, they certainly haven't been yet. So what's proposed currently is a €100 cheque back to people, whether they have their own water supply, whether they're part of a public supply. It seems that everybody's going to receive €100. It's been called a conservation grant, yet there is no link with conservation. There is no incentive, and it's not clear whether people will be required to prove that they're using it as some form of investment. If the government was serious about conserving water, there would be schemes introduced along the lines as we have seen for insulating homes and so on, that would actually encourage people to build tanks, to use brown water and so on. None of that is envisaged. The legislation also introduces a so-called plebiscite on ownership of Irish water, and there's much made of the fact that there will be a requirement for a vote of the Dáil and Seanad to change ownership structures in Irish water. Well, I mean, it's hard to believe that this is even seriously contained in this legislation, given that both government parties operate a three-line whip on every single vote. So we know that no government deputy and no government senator is ever going to vote against the government if the government were to choose to change the ownership structures of Irish water. So it's in fact entirely irrelevant, unless of course the government plans on adopting Deputy Peter Matthews' legislation, which would weaken the whip system in the new year, though I won't be holding my breath for that. So this is a total nonsense, this so-called double lock. It's window dressing, and really this bill is full of window dressing and populist pandering. There's going to be a public water forum, yet another entity to be ignored by the government. I mean, if the government ignores this elected chamber, this institution of democracy, as it has done over the last 3.5 years, and particularly in the case of Irish water, as it did on the 18th of December last year, why on earth should we believe that it will give any heed to a so-called public water forum, which has no standing other than being an opportunity to pretend that the government is interested in listening to people? It's a farce, and it's an insult, and I really don't believe that Irish people are gullible enough to buy it. All of this ensures that the Fine Gael promise regarding the Irish water system will never be delivered. There's no conservation. There are fixed charges, flat rate charges that have no link whatsoever to consumption of water. There are no economies of scale or efficiency. And I really do think it's important to mention and to highlight former Minister Phil Hogan's secret deal, which was conducted under the guise of this Irish Water Consultative Group. It ensures that the sort of savings and efficiencies that were promised cannot and will not be delivered. And after the Irish water legislation was rammed through on the 18th of December last year, just a few weeks later, John Fitzgerald of the ESRI published a report which showed that Irish Water was going to take on 2,000 more staff than is required to provide an efficient delivery of water across the state. And he estimated, and might have been a slight overestimation, but he estimated that that would cost the Irish taxpayer an additional €2 billion over the next 10 to 12 years. It may be closer to a figure of €1.5 billion, but to be honest, it is such an enormous amount of taxpayers' money. It really is quite indefensible. And I often look at the HSE and the opportunity that was there to deliver efficiencies when merging the health boards all over the country. And frankly, the then Minister Micheál Martin bottled it and gave in to the pressure from various unions and vested interests, and failed to create the sort of state-of-the-art health delivery service that we deserve and that our taxpayers deserve and our citizens deserve. And the exact same thing has happened here. Phil Hogan, in the interests of getting this through, clearly not a lot of thought went into it. As he said himself, he wasn't interested in micromanaging this process. He decided he'd just outsource decision-making, as Bertie Ahern did for many years, outsource decision-making to trade unions. And it was such an unrepresentative group. There was nobody there to represent the public interest. There was nobody there behind these closed doors to represent taxpayers' interest. It was simply the interest of closed-shop trade unions, who, by and large, in my experience, many of the trade union leaders represent their own interests rather than necessarily their members' interests. It's a really unfortunate outcome that this behind closed doors secretive group arrived at decisions on behalf of the state, it would appear, arrived at decisions on behalf of the Minister for the then Minister for the Environment, presented it as a fait accompli, and the whole thing was stitched up so that a 12-year cosy deal between the local authorities and Irish Water and the unions was agreed on, so that we were presented with a super quango with 4,000 staff members rather than the 2,000 that are objectively required, and it has become a sprawling monster. And anybody, and I presume government ministers in the same way as opposition TDs, are dealing with queries and complaints in relation to Irish Water all the time. And I have to say, I feel sorry for some of the staff, because they have taken abuse, and I don't condone that. I don't condone the way Irish Water staff have been spat at, the way they have been heckled and abused in certain parts of the country, any more than I condone the treatment of the Taoiseach, the Joan Burton. It was absolutely appalling. But many of the Irish Water staff just have not been able or capable of responding to the myriad of complaints and the myriad of problems that have arisen. So the fact that the organisation is overstaffed by 100% seems to be in no way contributing to a better or more efficient service delivery. Certainly in my experience and the experience of people in my constituency, that is the case. But it is a real shame. It's a real shame that the sort of Bertie Ahern style of secret deals with the unions has led us to this, because there was a much more open way, there was a more transparent way, and it's what Irish taxpayers expected from this government, and it's what they deserve. It's not your money, ministers. It's not the money of the government. It's the money of the people who work and pay their taxes and who contribute to this country and have contributed enormously to the economic recovery over the last couple of years. Yet, taxpayers' money is treated as though often it's treated like confetti. It's certainly treated as though it's the prerogative or the luxury of the government to buy peace and quiet for themselves by spending taxpayers' money. The addition to every bill in the country is actually €100 on foot of that particular secret deal. €100 on the bill of every household for the next 10 years. That's what it equates to. I think it's extraordinary that there hasn't been more focus on this, because I think if the public were aware of it, they would be even angrier about Irish Water than they are currently. So, Minister, I feel really disappointed, I have to say. This country was on the brink at the end of 2010, the start of 2011. The Troika came into town, put in place a pretty clear programme, which was implemented by and large. And they brought this country back from the brink. And I give credit to some government ministers for the role they played in that too. But in just over a year since the exit of the Troika from this country, this government has actually completely and utterly forgotten and lost touch with the reality that they are now practicing the exact same type of politics that brought us to this point, that brought us to the brink in the first place. Nothing has been learned, no lessons have been learned We are practicing the exact same kind of crony politics, the exact same convenient, lazy politics that led us to the brink in the first place. And that is a huge indictment of the government. It is a huge indictment. And it is no surprise to me that the combined support of the government parties in a poll yesterday morning was 25%. It's no surprise. And you know, you can try and browbeat the electorate and threaten them about the prospect of the rise of Sinn Féin. I don't relish the rise of Sinn Féin, I can assure you of that. I think that Sinn Féin economics would bankrupt and destroy this country. But you've nobody to blame but yourselves. You've nobody to blame but yourselves for letting down the Irish public, for dashing their hopes, for promising great promises in New Era, in the election manifestos and the programme for government, for promising a democratic revolution, for promising a new way of doing business, a new way of running the state, one based on efficiency, safeguarding taxpayers' money, looking out for the public interest. And you failed.
Thank you, Deputy.
And in just over 12 months, you have failed. And it's no wonder that we see the rise of extremists and we see the rise of Sinn Féin in this country. And until you address it and start taking seriously the concerns of Irish citizens and start representing the people who voted for you and the interests that elected you in the first place, and then, you know, I think that this country will be in a very sorry place after the next election.